Welcome back to Fact Bloom Insights. Today, we're going to learn more about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So let's jump right into it. The Great Chicago Fire started on Sunday, October 8, 1871. The fire was in an area that is now known as Chicago's near west side. This was a poor, mostly immigrant neighborhood. Most of the people who lived there were Irish immigrants, and their descendants who had come to Chicago because they were fleeing the Irish famine that began back in 1845, at the time of the fire. This community had around 3,000 buildings made out of wood. There was a single-engine company whose job it was to protect all these buildings. They were located at 1829 West Randolph Street, but they did not have enough resources to fight a major fire. Their equipment was outdated, and they only had one building for storage. In fact, at the time, the entire city of Chicago only had 182 firefighters. So the task of fighting fires was really left up to volunteers. One reason why this fire got out of control so quickly was because of the winds. Chicago that night was hit by a northeaster. These are powerful winds coming off of Lake Michigan that can reach speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. This made the fire spread very quickly, and it was impossible to stop its path of destruction. It would be 3 days of total havoc, until finally the fire ended up running out of fuel. It is not exactly clear what started the fire, but we do know that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in her barn, and that is what ignited everything. She was an Irish immigrant who lived at 137th and 138th. Her husband was an ex-policeman who was recently put on the pension list because he could no longer do the job. He suffered from ill health after having his arm blown off in a boating accident. They also had 5 children. That night they had a party in their home, and after drinking heavily, Mr. O'Leary went to bed and left his wife and the children to clean up. Mrs. O'Leary claimed that she had nothing to do with the fire, but she became known as the woman who caused the Great Chicago Fire. Another possible cause of the fire was that the city had been experiencing a hot and dry summer. Also, the city had recently gone through a period of intense economic growth. And with that growth came overcrowding and lots of flammable buildings. There was also little to no regulations when it came to building codes. For example, most buildings were made out of wood and they were packed together very closely. Also, most roofs were made out of either sawdust or shavings. And there were many buildings in the city that had been built over swamps. In addition, it was said that the fire department had been underfunded and the equipment was inadequate. On top of that, all of these factors, there was also claims that arson may have played a role. There were rumors that a former mayor was involved. His name was John C. Black. He had been accused of embezzling city funds, and now he stood to make money by collecting insurance policies. Also, the person who was set to become mayor in the upcoming election was Richard J. O'Gara, and he had been investigating Black for all of his shady dealings. So there were accusations that maybe O'Hara set the fire so that Black couldn't become mayor. I should also mention that there were some people who profited from the Great Chicago Fire. There was a man named George R. Davis. He was a broker who bought and sold city lots. And because he owned lots outside of the city limits, he saw an opportunity. He spent the next day riding around the countryside posting signs that read "Beware of fire." So that way farmers would not let their cattle loose and run them into the burning city. Then when he returned to Chicago, he purchased several acres of land just outside the city limits for $1. Then he resold those same pieces of land to people who needed somewhere to live, making him a ton of money. So now, let's talk about how many people were affected by this disaster. Over 100,000 people were left homeless. Around 2,200 buildings were destroyed, which included churches, schools, factories, warehouses, saloons, hotels, theaters, and homes. 3 miles of the city was completely devastated. And here's some more specific numbers. 106 companies and firms were destroyed, 18 factories and mills, 30 blocks of stores, 117 acres of buildings, 30 warehouses, and 3 miles of railroad were also damaged. The damage was worth an estimated $200 million, or if you adjusted for inflation, it would be around $5 billion. Many people lost everything. Victims of the fire were mostly poor immigrants. While they were staying in makeshift camps, conditions were terrible. There was disease, hunger, and people were dying. Many refugees left the city and never came back. Others stayed behind to salvage whatever they could from their destroyed homes. A lot of different groups and organizations helped out after the fire, such as the American Red Cross. They provided food, clothing, and medical care to those who needed it. But it wasn't enough. Not everyone received assistance. In fact, within weeks, thousands of people were still living in tents or whatever shelter they could find. People were still sleeping outdoors in below freezing temperatures. So relief efforts were not enough. The government had to step in, and they established military camps to house people, called these tent cities. Also, President Grant declared that federal troops would help maintain order and keep people safe. But there was still a lot of suffering. There was a lack of sanitation, there was contaminated water, and so disease was rampant. Cases of typhoid fever, pneumonia, and diarrhea were widespread. Over 1,200 people died as a direct result of the fire. Some died from injuries or smoke inhalation, while others died from diseases that I already mentioned. After the fire, many people began rebuilding their lives. They had to start from scratch. They lost their jobs, their homes, and their entire life savings. But the city did grow out of this tragedy. A new city hall was constructed in 1872. It was designed by William W. Boyington, and it cost $100,000 to build. In 1873, work began on the first of several water towers that supplied the city with clean drinking water. And also in 1873, the McCormick Reaper Company opened a factory in Chicago. They moved their headquarters from Cincinnati, Ohio. And this was the beginning of Chicago's transformation from a small village into an industrial metropolis. And lastly, it was during the rebuilding phase that the famous architect, Daniel Burnham, and a landscape architect named Jens Jensen, designed what would become Millennium Park. This park was created on the 18th Division burned area. Hopefully this video answered your question. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to follow the next videos.